And I ask that our previous speakers please join us up on the stage for some questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes before our scheduled break. The next session would begin at 10:30, but I think it'd be fine if we cut into that for a few minutes if there are any lingering questions during this session. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I heard the word shellscapes and futurescapes, and then we're talking about terrestrial landscapes. And I like all these words, and we're brought here together to talk about maritime cultural landscapes. And I was wondering if Margot, Jeff, Ken, and actually others could talk about the relationship between all of those words, and if they're the same thing, or if what the different words mean.
Well,
it's so open, I'm sorry.
I get blamed for futurescapes, I guess. I had a Professor Martin Wopes at UMass that would talk about how we should look at the archaeological record as alternative futures, so I got to get him credit for that basic idea. And it really is a different perspective that requires that we back off the idea that there was some sort of cultural transformation that occurred with the Enlightenment. And even critics of modernity like Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck, they still use the ancient past as a benchmark against which to measure Western progress, right? So somehow we transcended the world of living by fate alone when we realized that we could understand the world and apply science to intervene and come up with alternatives, right? Native peoples did that throughout the entire course of human history. And so looking at the archaeological record rather as a series of alternative futures it means looking at the archaeological record as people taking their prior experience, which could be inscribed in ways that transcend generational time, and then using it to basically plan for futures. And sometimes that's revolutionary. Sometimes it's achieving goals of the way things ought to be rather than the way things are. And other times it's more reproducing structures as they are, but it requires that they intervene. They don't just simply wait for shit to happen. They take matters into their own hands. And if we actually look at the archaeological record that way, it has great more relevance for futures planning for ourselves than it does simply benchmarking those that were unable to handle their own futures, right? So to me, it's a convenient term for that. It's got a science fiction connotation to it, as does terraforming. But I think it's important that we take that cognitive leap of looking at the ancient past as being a series of interventions rather than just responses to stimuli that they couldn't control themselves, right? So.
But getting back just to the idea of naming and the names and the words that we use, I would say that a maritime landscape, like you said, that's almost oxymoronic, right? Landscape. So we do need to maybe think about broadening the terms and the language that we use and these sort of things. You're thinking about space in a more general way that so you don't get this divide between the terrestrial and the marine, because what we're seeing here is the integration of these spaces, and not just spatially but temporally as well. And we need to start thinking about them in terms like that. So I don't know what words to use in place of those, but I think it is something that we ought to start thinking about.
I got a question for Margot. The shell rings you got multiple component sites at all these places, starting with the Archaic, and the Archaic are the typical Archaic shell rings, and they're the simplest of all the shellwork constructions, but they seem to be at a lower level in the topography there, maybe by a foot, but the bottoms seem to be submerged, whereas the other landscapes are a little higher and certainly much more complex and big. I'm wondering, is part of the reason that they abandoned the shell rings because of sea level rise? Do you have any data on that? And that you're trying to escape it? They also, all the shell rings seem to be at the lowest level towards the lowest points on the seascapes, and the other one seems just to be higher than the others. And I just wondered if they had both ceremonial functions and a practical function to get the hell out of the water.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely there's been sea level rise changes, and we know that. One of my questions as to why they would abandon that area, I mean, if they appear to be abandoned because they could have built on top of them. So I don't think that it's definitely that they're moving to escape sea level rise. I think it's a cultural response to moving their occupation to a different area.
And they're building that area because that area. How deep have you gone? Is it down to base rock to bedrock? Is it on the marsh?
No, and unfortunately, we've never been able to get to the bottom.
Todd, how replicable do you think this type of shell construction is, say, to the Pacific Coast?
Well, I started my career with Ken at Florida, and so I tell everyone, I tell every southeastern archaeologist I know that we have shell midden envy on the West Coast. I mean, we don't. I mean, we see massive shell mounds on the West Coast, but not this sort of larger ceremonial process of mounding that seems to be happening in other parts of North America. But one thing I will say is, like, I think we're using this and this is kind of an aside, but I think we're using this term maritime landscape because it's easier for us to see manipulations on landscape, right, with these shell mounds and shell rings and all this sexy stuff. But what I see with my work is that indigenous communities were altering seascapes as well, kelp forest ecosystems, intentionally, creating reductions in otters to cause, the blossoming and greater availability of economically important shellfish. So that's just harder to see, right? And it's harder to quantify. But these are truly anthropogenic seascapes that are being created intentionally in my mind, although I get a lot of criticism for that, like whether it was intentional or a byproduct of indigenous activities, and that's hard to get at. I find it hard to believe that it is not a sort of intentional activity because it's maintained for millennia.
Yeah. I can add real quickly, I've been inspired by Todd's work to look at, and have, not me myself, but get my grad students to look at the possibility that they're manipulating aquatic resources and environment. So I have a grad student that's finishing her thesis that has pretty convincing evidence for oyster mariculture dating to AD 200 to 600 in that study area of ours by looking at very subtle evidence like whether there's parasitism scars on or parasitism on attachment scars from busting up clusters and then putting them back and shelling the beds. And it's a really convincing argument, but again, it's one of those things that could also be explained by the byproduct of exploitation rather than an intentional thing. I like to see it intentional coincides with the terraforming. So it's like, well, we're going to produce a lot of oysters not only to sustain ourselves biologically, but for the gods, right?
And I think ultimately it doesn't quite matter whether it was intentional or not, in my mind, because it happened and it's an anthropogenic environment, right?
Yeah. I agree with that perspective. It probably was intentional, but does it really matter?
Right.
Because the end result is the same.
I think it would matter if we could document that the temporality of those actions was outstripping anything of the Western mind, that they really saw it as like the seventh generation Iroquois kind of perspective that we need for these to be sustained for 7 generations or 20 generations. And if it's that, I mean, that kind of temporality is what we need today, and we could learn a lot from that.
Yeah, I think it matters if you're trying to get into the minds of these people and get beyond just simple looking at how the environment itself reacted to people living there, but actually starting to look at some of the people themselves, some of the things Ken was talking about, getting into the experiences of the people themselves. And yeah, that's hard to do. It's tough. But if we don't try to do that, I think that's a wasted opportunity.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And the challenge becomes when you talk to ecologists and biologists and telling them that,
right, they don't
we're getting into, it's a hard sell sometimes when you're talking across the disciplines.
Right.
Well, that's where traditional ecological management studies come in really useful, because you do see that the agency behind these activities, and I think that's, at least in my work, it's been nice that you've got First Nations in Ontario and other parts of Canada who are involved with the same processes we're seeing ecologically or archaeologically in other places.
Mm.
Hi, thank you. Just a quick question. I'd like to hear an answer from everybody. One word I haven't heard much the last day and a half is resiliency, and human adaptation and resiliency, especially in the current modern context of planning for climate adaptation. And I'm just curious, how many of you have been approached by American Planning Association, other partners in your communities where you're working, where you're conducting this field work, to engage in informing current adaptation and resiliency planning with what you've learned from the past? How many of you have been engaged by those communities or have reached out to those communities, and what kind of experiences have you had?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent much of my career trying to reach out to those communities with very mixed results. I mean, you know, again, when you're speaking across the disciplines and there's an issue of resolution and precision that archaeologists, in many people's minds, have a hard time meeting the precision and accuracy standards of an ecologist and a biologist and a resource manager, right? So for some, you know, some see archaeological records as critical for modern management and extending baselines and dealing with overfishing and the crisis of our oceans. Some, I've had experiences that just don't get it, you know, and are uninterested. So I think it's changing, but for me it's been a hard sell at times.
How about you guys?
Well, I can add a little. Some of our partnerships that we have in the National Park Service are universities. We're currently working with the University of Central Florida biologists to do ecosystem restoration in Canaveral National Seashore, and we sort of approached each other. They were doing just oyster restoration, and when we learned that they were just doing oyster restoration anywhere that would work within the ecosystem, we partnered with them and said, well, why don't we target archaeological sites? So instead of doing hard armoring like seawalls and things like that to protect sites against erosion, we're working with them to build living shorelines, restoring oyster beds and the native grasses. And we have a model that works really great, and so it's been a great experience for the community. We're using local school groups. The kids learn how to grow the mangroves, and you know, a year later we have these large public days where we engage the community, come out for civil engagement, and help to do restoration. And so that's worked really well, and that's a model we want to bring down to the Everglades as well. And we think is a good. I really like what Ken was saying about needing to be relevant and engaging, and having archaeology be more than just, you know, entertainment or our own interests. So when we can use some example like that to bring it to a community, I think it's pretty successful.
For me, the trick is engaging those managers from the onset of the project, rather than generating archaeological perspectives and then handing that to folks.
There's been some really interesting work in Michigan with sturgeon, and because of damming the rivers and things like that, the natural migrations and movements of sturgeon have changed over time. And so the Michigan DNR has been requesting that archaeologists who find sturgeon remains on sites make that information available to the DNR so that they can do genetic testing on that, and then compare that with the genetic signature of the sturgeon that might still be in that river basin and might not be, and see if these management practices, you know, whether it's controlling the water for dams or other things, pollution and whatnot, have changed the dynamic of those populations and how that comes into play. So, you know, there's all sorts of ways that it's got to be. Sometimes you have to seek it out, and in that case, the DNR sought out archaeologists because somebody realized that archaeologists find old stuff.
Yeah.
We have something similar in terms of sea turtles on the barrier islands, where sea turtles nest in the same place year after year after year, but those things change over time as well. And so they're quite interested archaeologically where sea turtles nested during different periods of time. We have these vast periods of time where we have no sea turtles whatsoever archaeologically, and then all of a sudden they appear in the archaeological record and then disappear again. And so it's quite interesting whether that's influenced by human predation or environmental change or the rest of it.
I don't
Judge
know
Harris
how
has
it's
one
done.
final question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ken, you referenced anticipated burial movements
Yes, sir.
and the use of a solstice grid. Could you tell us a bit more about that astronomy and how you arrived at it?
Primarily, I arrived at it primarily through other people's work, in particular folks like Bill Romaine, that's substantiated that Poverty Point in northeast Louisiana is laid out to the solstices, and Bill Haig and a guy named Belcher did it back in the 70s, I think. But he's a formally trained archaeoastronomer, and so he's published locally on it. He hasn't done anything nationally on it, but that encouraged me. But when we were out there, the first thing that I noticed about alignments is much like what Jeff was talking about, is that the later period folks, about AD 200 to 900, had aligned a lot of those rings to solstices. So the one I work on, Shell Mound, there's a burial mound, there's an arc that's open to the rising winter solstice sun with a burial mound and then alignment. So if you're standing at the burial mound looking, you see the setting summer solstice. If you're standing on top of the mound looking at the burial mound, you see the rising winter solstice sun. And so I just started playing with those angles. And in the mid-latitudes where we are, what's fabulous about the solstices is that they create equilateral triangles. So it's not just about time, of like gauging the migration of the sun from the south to the north in the horizon, but equilateral triangles give you the possibility of maintaining meridians or any lines you want, basically, over great distances. So you do it through triangulation, right? It's very simple. I mean, anybody can do it. I can teach anybody to do it with two pieces of equal length cordage. You need 3 individuals, and you could pull this off. So that's why Poverty Point local scale orientation or mapping was done. So I started thinking, is that a metaphor for change, too? Rather than just an annual migration of the sun, could this be scaled to larger term, lower frequency changes over longer periods of time? And mapping those onto the land so that they become inscribed. So you emplace at the intersection of these standard distances, caches, burial mounds, or settlements, so that they're inscribed on the landscape. And actually, this gets really fanciful and crazy enough. Nobody's going to want to publish this, right? I got to write this for a trade press, not for the profession. But I think this has played out over 2,000 years to the point where the entire southeast United States was on this massive solar or solstice grid. And it didn't mean that it was laid out like, as urban planning. It's just that that practice at smaller scales gets, in a sense, like fractal, that it gets played out over larger and larger scales because that sun's movement and its position on the horizon was the one thing that was constant. It was moving, but it moved in ways that could be replicated generation after generation after generation. And it worked famously, I think. Pretty fanciful. I wanted to add the thing about the resilience thing. It's very frustrating, even within our own discipline. I wrote a paper last year for American Anthropologists framing it as a policy issue for Miami. Miami's plight is like certain. They're underwater in 50 years, right? 5.5 million people, half of them got to be displaced. I wrote it as a policy issue, but I used archaeology to exemplify how people in the past dealt with changes like that. It went out, they sent it out to review, and somebody was a policy person, I guess, in applied anthropology. They actually wrote, you should talk to an archaeologist about how archaeological data can be used more effectively. Because I was using language that was weird, like futurescapes and alternative futures. So we got a translation problem. The resolution issues, the temporality, the scale of that's all got to be changed if we're going to actually mobilize knowledge about the past for futures. Younger generation, the old guys like me, we're pretty much too far gone, I guess.
Well, I thank you all once again. In the interest of time, we're going to proceed with our break. The next session is scheduled to begin at 10:30, and so I'd like to give you all another round of applause for your